So we're now going to ask participants to share their thoughts about a number of questions focused on potential recommendations. The questions we've asked you to consider, or at least some of the questions in the time that you have, are how should access to firearms be regulated in Canada? Do you think the present regime is sufficient, or should it be revisited? How can laws about the possession, importation, and transfer of firearms be effectively enforced? Do you have additional suggestions for the regulation of access to firearms and the enforcement of regulations? And what would success look like to you in this area?
Segment.
So
I think it's important. It's always been important to me to remember why we're all here. We're here, and maybe I misunderstand, but we're here to figure out what happened in Nova Scotia specifically and how that can be prevented in the future. And when I got involved in this whole thing, it wasn't to use this opportunity to create a platform for organization or to push my agenda forward. You know, I think that there's an important role for people that understand the current laws, and there's an important role to see things from different perspectives other than the perspectives of the usual people that you see that show up at these things to provide their opinion. So a variety of opinions, I think, are very helpful, and I think it's really important to stay focused on this event because this is why we're here. So the first question was, how should access to firearms be regulated in Canada? Do you think the present regime is sufficient, or should it be revisited? And when I did my my report, my written preliminary report and the oral presentation, the report itself really focused on this situation. It was 6 pages long because what happened in Nova Scotia was not complex on most levels and extremely complex from one dimension. So basically, as we know, what happened was we had an individual that broke completely from our society, broke completely from the implied social contract, the observance of laws, of morality, of everything. And because there's that physical reality, I don't want to repeat my entire oral presentation from last time, but because of that physical reality, any regulations that had existed were rendered completely meaningless to this individual. The only intervention that had the potential of stopping something like this or preventing it from happening in the first place was a physical intervention. That's just reality. It's not debatable. When it comes to firearm regulation in Canada, firearms are very strictly regulated. They've been regulated for a long time this way. I hate to say it, but there was no regulation that would have done anything to prevent this. So when it comes to the current regime, I think it's a separate discussion because it didn't have any bearing on what happened there. I went over, again, in the last block, I went over the circumstances of what happened. And if you look at it from the perspective of any regulation, I would say the most likely regulation that would have came into play was the current red flag provisions in the criminal code in section 117 that basically says, and in an unambiguous manner, says that police can seize firearms from any situation, basically for any reason, if they believe at the time it negatively impacts public safety. Now, this individual did not have a firearms license. This individual did not participate in the firearms community in Canada. He wasn't in possession of any legally held firearms. And barring any other information, I believe virtually all of his firearms were illegally imported from the United States, other than one firearm that was obtained through fraud and that, as far as we know, was never actually used against anyone. So the access to firearms via the regulation had no bearing. So it's very difficult to shoehorn that conversation into the context of what happened in Nova Scotia. So is the present regime sufficient? Should it be revisited? I think it's a separate conversation. How can laws about the possession, importation, and transfer of firearms be effectively enforced? Well, there are laws on the books that could have given police the legal ability to intervene in a lot of the bad behavior exhibited by the perpetrator. Obviously, the time for intervention was 10 years before the actual events in 2020. But again, I think that should be a big part of that conversation. As far as additional suggestions for regulation of access to firearms, again, none of these regulations came into play whatsoever. This individual sourced his firearms out of the jurisdiction. And again, you know, when someone reports that somebody has illegal firearms, it's the duty of police to follow up on that and to seize those firearms or do whatever is necessary. Now, one of the other aspects, the complex part of all this, I think, and again, just my opinion is how many regulations, how many laws are too much? Because with an individual that behaves in a bizarre and potentially violent manner, so making violent threats, again, as I mentioned, to my understanding, against his own parents, how do you take someone out of society for potentially being violent? So that, I think that's going to be the most complex conversation. I hope that there's a place for that conversation in the commission, because that's an important question. Obviously, we can't just start snatching people, you know, out of their homes because they behave in a different way than anyone else. And how long can you hold someone for uttering threats? How long can you hold them in jail? So to me, that's the real complicated part of all this. So as far as what success would look like, success would be that violence like this never happens again. But I think it's probably important to understand that whether it's violence from illegally smuggled firearms, whether it's violence with firearms that are legally held in the country, which doesn't happen that often, but it does happen. Whether it's a van attack, killing 10 and injuring 16 in a matter of 7 minutes, or whether it's something that we saw yesterday in Canada. I think if we really focus on recognizing violence before it starts, intervening in violent behavior, no matter how it's perpetrated, I think that should be the focus if we really want a safer Canada, and we leave the agendas out of it. And I think if we ever want to get to that place where we even witness what success looks like, we have to start being honest with ourselves and deal with the root causes of violence. And again, as a final comment, as I said, I wasn't going to take too long, but this particular perpetrator was a very complicated case. This wasn't someone from, you know, urban inner city gang life or whatever that you could see that situation coming for a long time, had a long rap sheet so that person could be incarcerated to keep him out of the public. This was a very complex situation. There were no regulations I don't think there is a regulation period that could have been implemented to stop this from happening. And we have to look at violent behavior altogether and what we can do when people are exhibiting that kind of behavior. I think that's what the commission is about. We're all searching for answers that are a little bit hard to find. So I appreciate the time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Giltaca.